They thought they could scare an old man into paying fake HOA fees. They sent a demolition crew to tear down the boathouse he built with his late wife, and the smug HOA president thought she had won. What she didn't know, his entire family are federal agents, and when you target the wrong man, sometimes the law comes knocking on your door instead. This isn't just a story about a cabin on a lake. It's about how a petty HOA tyrant lost everything the moment she picked the wrong fight. The mist over the lake hung low that morning, the kind of soft gray veil that carried peace in its silence. At 68, mornings like that were treasures, small, steady reminders that the world could still be kind. The cabin stood behind me, a place built with my own hands and my late wife's vision, its timbers soaked with 30 years of memories. It wasn't just a house. It was a promise, a legacy. The day began the same as always, coffee ground fresh, steam curling against the window panes, slippers damp from the dock's morning dew. But peace doesn't always last. Sometimes it shatters with something as simple as a flash of color. Bright orange. A notice was nailed to the boathouse door, the nail hammered deep into wood my wife and I had once painted together. My stomach tightened as I pulled it free. The words at the top hit me like a slap. Lakeside Pines Homeowners Association. Below, in bold letters, it screamed, "Final notice, unpaid dues, demolition scheduled." The amount they claimed I owed was precise, official-looking, all under $1,740.26. They listed violations that were laughable in their absurdity. Non-compliant dock maintenance, unapproved siding, exterior paint out of code. My dock was the same one I had rebuilt myself just last summer. My cabin had been the same shade of brown for decades. None of it mattered. According to their notice, I had 3 days to pay or they would tear it down. Confusion came before anger. My land wasn't part of Lakeside Pines. It never had been. My grandfather's deed, locked in my file cabinet, made that clear. My property sat half a mile outside their little fiefdom of manicured lawns and petty rules. Surely, I thought, this was just a clerical mistake, a wrong address, a mix-up that could be solved with a phone call. The woman who answered the HOA's line spoke with a sugary sweetness, the kind of voice trained to sound helpful while concealing barbs. She insisted their records showed my parcel was annexed 6 weeks ago. A community vote, she called it. She promised it would be fixed. That reassurance should have calmed me, but instead, it unsettled me more. Something about her tone felt rehearsed, slippery. The next morning, any illusion that this was a mistake was bulldozed, almost literally. The sound came first, heavy and grinding, the kind of noise that rattles glass in the panes. Tires crunched over gravel outside. I looked out my front window and my heart sank. A flatbed truck idled in my driveway, carrying a backhoe large enough to reduce my boathouse to splinters in minutes. A foreman in a reflective vest climbed down, clipboard in hand, his face the blank mask of a man who had long ago stopped caring about the jobs he was sent to do. He wasn't here to talk. He wasn't here to question. He was here to destroy. The words on his clipboard carried weight. According to his work order, they had the right to demolish not just the boathouse but the cabin itself if the site wasn't cleared. Either I handed over $12,000 or watched my life's work crumble. There was no reasoning with him. He was a tool, as blunt and unfeeling as the machine he brought. And that's when reality struck. The pleasant voice on the phone had never intended to resolve anything. The notice, the threats, the clerical error, it was all by design. This wasn't a mistake. This was a move, a calculated strike against someone they thought was an easy mark. But I wasn't alone. Fear shifted into something else, focus. My children weren't just family, they were federal agents. Law enforcement wasn't just their job, it was their bloodline. When the foreman parked his machine in my driveway, he thought he was bullying a retiree. What he didn't know was that while his backhoe idled, my kids were already moving into place. I began to document everything. Photographs of the truck, the license plates, the foreman himself. I dug into the file cabinet and laid out proof of ownership, deeds, surveys, tax bills, every piece of evidence that showed this land was mine and always had been. With each picture, with each step of documentation, fear gave way to clarity. The clerk at the county records office provided the final piece, a certified plat map showing my property lying completely outside the HOA's jurisdiction. That paper, stamped and sealed, felt heavier than gold. Proof, irrefutable. But relief lasted only a moment. Because as I drove home, my daughter's words came back sharp as a knife. This wasn't an error. This was a target. The HOA president, a woman named Mara Jansen, wasn't new to the game. She had a history, a trail of altered maps and falsified votes stretching across counties. She knew the system and how to twist it, shifting property lines on paper until they swallowed land that wasn't hers. Then she swooped in, bleeding homeowners with fines until they broke. And now she had chosen me. When I pulled into my driveway, the demolition crew was gone. But the fight was far from over. From the tree line, another figure stood, camera in hand, lens pointed at my windows. He was recording violations that didn't exist, laying the groundwork for the next round of harassment. By the time I noticed him, he was gone. They weren't retreating. They were escalating. But Mara had made a fatal mistake. She believed she was pressuring a tired old man into surrender. She thought I would cave, pay, or sell. She didn't know that my children were already on their way, bringing not just support, but the weight of the law with them. The quiet lake morning was gone. In its place stood the first skirmish of a war. A war Mara Jansen thought she was winning. She was wrong. Because that night, as the sun dipped over the lake, black sedans rolled into my driveway one after another. My family had arrived, and with them came the beginning of the end for Lakeside Pines. By the time the sun slipped below the trees, the cabin no longer felt like a quiet refuge. It had transformed into something else entirely, a command post. What had once been a place for homework, Sunday dinners, and holiday laughter was now a table covered with evidence, laptops, maps, and legal documents. The kitchen where my children grew up had become the front line in a battle I hadn't asked for, but one we were now determined to win. They came in shifts, their cars dark and official, pulling up the driveway without fanfare. My daughter Dana was the first. She didn't arrive as my child coming home to help her aging father. She arrived as an agent, calm, precise, and already scanning the property as though it were an active crime scene. Minutes later, my sons followed. Ray, with the steady intensity he carried from Homeland Security, and Mark, restless but sharp-eyed, every movement of his hand betraying his career in tracking fraud through the smallest of details. They didn't waste time on sympathy. They didn't need to. They saw the wreckage already forming around me. Threats on paper, a demolition order in motion, strangers photographing my home. Instead of comforting words, they brought order, method, and purpose. The first thing placed on the table was my certified plat map, fresh from the county clerk's office. Its bold black lines cut clean and undeniable across the paper. My land sat well outside the reach of Lakeside Pines. Dana placed it in the center of the table like a shield, a foundation stone for everything to come. Then came the contrast. From her laptop, Dana produced another map, the one that Mara Jansen had filed just 6 weeks earlier. At first glance it seemed the same, but the differences revealed themselves like a magician's trick once measured. A boundary line had shifted, nudged north by a mere 200 feet, subtle enough to go unnoticed by the average eye, but precise enough to swallow my dock, my boathouse, and my cabin whole. The realization hit like a slow, sinking weight. Mara hadn't just filed paperwork. She had stolen my land on paper, as casually as someone shifting lines on a drawing. But maps weren't enough. Forgery needs witnesses, signatures, the illusion of consent. That was her next move. My youngest, Mark, slid another sheet of paper across the table. It was a single-page document labeled Community Vote for Annexation. At the bottom was a neat column of signatures. Neighbors I had known, faces I could see as clearly as the lake at dawn. Except they were ghosts. Frank Miller, who had been dead for years. Joan Peterson, gone since her stroke. Carl Beasley, long moved to Florida. Their names had been stolen, their memories weaponized against me. Mara had forged not only documents but the very identities of people I had once called friends. It was more than criminal. It was personal. For a long moment, no one spoke. The 3 documents, the deed from my grandfather, the forged map, and the fraudulent vote, lay side by side. Together they told a story of greed, deception, and arrogance, a story in which I was meant to be the victim. But my children were not raised to sit quietly while predators circled. The plan that followed wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, methodical, born of years of discipline and training. Step 1. Document everything. Every notice, every threat, every action by the HOA would be logged, photographed, time-stamped, and preserved. Step 2. Expose their lies, not through confrontation, but through evidence. Let their own words, their own signatures, and their own schemes hang them. Step 3. Wait for them to overreach, because bullies always did. And Mara, in her arrogance, gave us that overreach sooner than expected. The rattle of the mail slot broke the silence. A crisp envelope hit the floor, hand-delivered, its logo stamped with the false authority of Lakeside Pines. Inside was a new bill. This time the fines had doubled. Nearly $24,000, including an invented violation for exterior paint that had not changed in 3 decades. The absurdity of it was almost laughable. A cabin that had stood the test of time was suddenly, according to them, worth tens of thousands in violations. The timing was perfect. Evidence delivered right to our door. My kids spread the letter next to the maps and fraudulent vote, their eyes cold with focus. This wasn't about enforcing rules. It was about crushing me under the weight of fake debt until I either paid or surrendered my land. The next morning, their tactics grew bolder. At dawn, the screech of metal outside jolted me awake. A massive dumpster had been dropped across my driveway, blocking all entry and exit. Spray painted on its side were the words, "Property of Lakeside Pines HOA, debris removal." They had turned my home into a cage. But cages only work if the prisoner accepts them. I didn't. I documented it. Photos, notes, timestamps. Every detail went into the GR. But cages only work if the prisoner accepts them. I didn't. I documented it. Photos, notes, timestamps. Every detail went into the growing case file we were building. Mark made a phone call, posing as the concerned son of an old man under siege, fishing for answers. On speaker, the HOA treasurer revealed more than he should have. His smug laughter dripped through the line as he admitted their true goal. Not compliance, not dues, but pressure. Enough pressure to force me to sell. It was extortion, pure and simple. And now, we had it recorded. By that afternoon, the county sheriff himself stood at my door. He couldn't drive down the blocked driveway, so he came on foot, his face grim as he accepted the formal cease and desist letter Dana had drafted. Minutes later, he walked to Mara Jansen's manicured home and placed the document in her hands. The mask of charm slipped from her face, revealing the fury underneath. She had been confronted not by fear, but by law. The dumpster was hauled away before sunset, the first visible retreat in a war she had thought she controlled. But victory was fleeting, because as night fell, my neighbor called. On the HOA's public Facebook page, a new post had appeared, a photo of my cabin, taken with that telephoto lens from the trees. Beneath it, in bold letters, the words, "Public notice of violation and non-compliance." My name tagged, my reputation dragged into the public square like a criminal in the stocks. The harassment was no longer private, it was now public. The HOA wasn't just trying to take my land, they were trying to take my name. And that shift, the move from intimidation to public humiliation, was the spark that turned neighbors into allies. One by one, the calls began. Others who had suffered at Mara's hands. Garden gnomes fined. Welcome mats deemed violations. Children's tricycles painted the wrong color. Each voice carried the same mix of anger and relief. Anger at being bullied. Relief at knowing they weren't alone. The war was no longer mine alone. The HOA had overplayed its hand, and the community was beginning to see the rot for what it was. But Mara wasn't finished. She would strike harder, faster, determined to prove her dominance. And when she did, she would find not an old man trembling in his cabin, but a family prepared for war. The fight had shifted, but it had only just begun. What had started as an orange notice nailed to my boathouse was now an open battle. The HOA had doubled fines, blocked my driveway, smeared my name in public, and still, they weren't satisfied. Bullies never are. When intimidation fails, they double down, and that doubling down would cost them everything. For a brief moment, there was hope. The cease and desist had forced a retreat. The dumpster was gone, the sheriff had handed Mara her warning, and for the first time in weeks, my driveway was clear. But victories against people like Mara Jansen are never permanent. They regroup. They wait. They plan their next strike. And Mara's strike was devastating. The day began normally enough. A Saturday morning errand. The kind of mundane trip to the hardware store that had been part of my life for decades. I wasn't gone long, 2 hours at most. But in that short time, Mara moved with ruthless precision. The sound reached me first, even before the road curved back toward my cabin. A harsh, buzzing roar that cut through the quiet woods. Not the low idle of a backhoe this time, but the shrill, hungry bite of chainsaws. My stomach turned cold as I pressed the accelerator. When I came around the bend, the sight stopped me in my tracks. Where my boathouse had stood, 30 years of wood, paint, laughter, and memory, there was nothing. Nothing but a raw, jagged pile of splintered timber and broken boards. The foreman, Ted, and his demolition crew had done their work with brutal efficiency. By the time I arrived, they were already packing up. Tools clanged against metal. Cigarettes were lit. Their faces were blank, as if tearing down a man's life was no different than clearing brush on a roadside. And just like that, the place where my wife and I once hammered shingles together, where we sat in lawn chairs watching sunsets, was gone. But the cruelty didn't stop at destruction. My neighbor Bill came running, breathless, his face pale with outrage. He had watched helplessly from the road. After the demolition crew left, another truck had arrived, a pickup driven by Mara's nephew. He hadn't come to help or even to survey the damage. He came to strip it bare, hauling away the best lumber, the old-growth cedar boards I had carefully preserved over the years. He called it salvage. I called it theft. I walked to the dock, now nothing more than a scar jutting into the lake, and sat down on its edge. The air smelled of raw wood and gasoline. My hands brushed across the jagged planks, and there, wedged in the splinters, was something smooth. A photograph. It was of me and Sarah, taken decades earlier, the summer we finished building that boathouse. We were younger, covered in sawdust, our smiles wide, her hand gripping the hammer like it was a trophy. That photograph, faded and bent, was the last surviving piece of what had just been stolen from me. For the first time since this began, I felt the fight leave me. It wasn't anger anymore. It was grief. Mara hadn't just attacked my property. She had torn down the memories, the sacred pieces of a life built with love. And as I stared at the ruins, the weight of it pressed down, heavier than anything I'd ever carried. My children found me there, sitting in silence. They didn't speak false comforts. They didn't tell me it would be okay, because they knew it wasn't. They simply stood beside me, their presence steady, their eyes hard with resolve. The quiet stretched until finally my son Ray broke it, his voice low and unshakable. This is it. No more defense. From here on out, we act. It was a turning point, the moment where everything shifted. We were done reacting. We were done waiting. The HOA had declared war, and now my family would bring it back to them. That night, the kitchen table became something different. Not a place for evidence and documents, but for strategy. Ray, the tactician, laid out the first step. Mara had shown her arrogance by demolishing the boathouse. She believed she was untouchable, above reproach, immune to consequence. That arrogance was a weapon we could turn against her. The plan was simple bait, a stack of lumber purchased from the hardware store neatly arranged on the dock where the boathouse once stood. Not enough to rebuild, but enough to look like the start of it. Next, decoy plans, drawn up by my own hand, detailed enough to look official, left in plain sight through the garage window. Notes scrawled in the margins. Exceeds code. Reinforced foundation. A tantalizing lure for a woman obsessed with control. While I laid the bait, Ray prepared the trap. 4 small motion-activated cameras, each no larger than a golf ball, hidden in plain sight. One inside a birdhouse overlooking the dock. Another tucked beneath the garage eaves, aimed at the decoy plans. A third concealed in a hedge along the property line. The last placed inside the cabin, angled through a window to capture the yard as a whole. Every movement, every trespass would be caught on video, transmitted directly to secure feeds on their phones. The stage was set. And then we waited. The first 2 days were uneventful, filled with the tension of anticipation. The cameras caught squirrels on the dock, a UPS driver with a package, even Bill's golden retriever sniffing the fresh lumber. Each alert made our hearts race, but each time it was nothing. By the 3rd day, I began to wonder if Mara had decided destruction was enough. Perhaps the demolition was her final move. Perhaps she thought she had already won. But predators can't resist circling back to gloat, and Mara was no exception. At 11:30 in the morning, the alert came. Ray's phone buzzed, and when he raised it, my blood ran cold. There she was, Mara Jansen, bold, brazen, walking down my driveway with a clipboard in one hand and her phone in the other. She moved as if she owned the place, as if trespassing was nothing more than her right. She stopped at the dock, photographing the stacked lumber, then turned her eyes toward the garage, exactly as planned. She leaned closer, pressing against the glass, her phone raised to capture the decoy plans. Every step, every glance, every motion was recorded crystal clear, and just as she snapped the photo, the sound of tires crunched on the gravel. Not one car. Two black SUVs, silent and deliberate, pulled into my driveway, cutting off her escape. The trap had sprung. The moment Mara raised her phone against the glass, convinced she was capturing evidence of a violation, the quiet gravel of my driveway betrayed her. Tires rolled, heavy and deliberate. Two black SUVs appeared, one after the other, sliding into position with precision. They didn't pull up casually. They didn't stop halfway. They boxed her in, sealing the driveway like a gate slamming shut. She spun around, confusion flashing across her face, quickly shifting into alarm. Gone was the smug composure of an HOA president on a petty crusade. In its place was something she hadn't expected to feel on my property: fear. The SUV doors opened with smooth efficiency. From the first vehicle, 3 figures stepped out, their suits dark, their movements crisp and economical. They weren't neighbors. They weren't contractors. They weren't there to argue about bylaws or dues. They were federal agents. From the second SUV, my daughter emerged. She wasn't dressed in a suit, just jeans and a plain jacket, but the authority in her stance outshone the rest. This wasn't Dana, my little girl, the one who grew up in this cabin. This was Special Agent Weller, the calm center of a storm she had helped create. Mara's face flushed, indignant red replacing pale shock. She puffed herself up, raising her voice with false authority. She declared that this was her jurisdiction, that she was the president of the Homeowners Association, that we were the trespassers. The words came sharp, brittle, desperate. But Dana didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply walked closer, stopping just a few feet away, her expression steady, her tone measured. The federal agents around her fanned out, securing the scene with practiced precision. Mara's bluster dissolved in the silence that followed, as if even she realized how hollow her words had become. And then, the county sheriff arrived. His cruiser pulled in behind the SUVs and he stepped out, papers in hand. He wasn't here for pleasantries. He wasn't here to mediate a neighborhood dispute. He was here to enforce. Without hesitation, he walked past Mara and straight toward the manicured entrance of Lakeside Pines. His deputies followed, carrying a stack of warrants. Search warrants, for Mara's home, for her office, for every place her lies might be hiding. The illusion of her kingdom began to crack in real time. Mara's eyes widened as she watched the sheriff march away. The weight of the moment finally seemed to hit her. This wasn't about HOA rules anymore. This wasn't about fines or paint colors or annexed property lines. This was criminal, and it was all unraveling at her feet. Dana closed the distance, calm as ever, and pulled out her credentials. She didn't flash them with drama. She held them steady, undeniable. Her voice shifted, stripped of warmth, carrying the weight of the government itself. She spoke the words that every criminal dreads, words Mara never thought she would hear directed at her rights. Right there, on the dock she had stolen and destroyed, in front of the cabin she had tried to claim, Mara Jansen was read the charges that would end her reign. The metallic click of handcuffs was loud in the morning air, echoing against the lake. For the first time, Mara didn't respond with words. No smug retort, no sugary condescension, just silence. The mask she had worn for years was gone, leaving nothing but a hollow, stunned woman who realized too late she had pushed too far. But this wasn't just about Mara. The search of her property revealed the machinery of her scheme in its entirety. Altered plat maps, carefully adjusted to annex land that was never hers. Forged community votes, signatures pulled from the dead, the absent, and the unsuspecting. Financial records funneled through her brother's so-called contracting company, a tidy slush fund built from the blood of fines and fees. Emails between her and her treasurer, Greg Purcell, laid out in cold text the very strategy they had used: stall, harass, intimidate, bleed until the victim sold. She hadn't been enforcing rules. She had been running an empire of fraud, hidden beneath the polite veneer of HOA authority. And now, every piece of it was being exposed. Greg himself cracked almost immediately. Faced with the evidence, with recordings of his own voice admitting to extortion, he folded. He confessed, trading cooperation for leniency. His betrayal sealed Mara's fate, stripping away her last ally and leaving her alone to face the consequences. The days that followed felt surreal. My cabin, once under siege, became the anchor of a federal case. My children worked tirelessly, their roles blending seamlessly between family and professionals. Mark dissected the fraudulent documents with the expertise of a postal inspector, explaining how notices hand-delivered were a deliberate attempt to skirt mail fraud charges. Ray cataloged the harassment tactics, framing them not as petty disputes but as coordinated intimidation strategies. Dana pulled everything together, shaping the evidence into a case so airtight it was nearly impossible to dispute. The trial was swift. Mara's defense crumbled under the sheer weight of the evidence. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had clearly seen her share of HOA tyrants, cut through the excuses with surgical precision. Every altered map, every forged signature, every fraudulent fine was laid bare. The jury barely needed to deliberate. Mara was found guilty of conspiracy, wire fraud, and extortion. Her treasurer, Greg, received his own sentence, lighter for his cooperation, but damning nonetheless. The judge didn't stop at conviction. She went further, making an example of them. Restitution was ordered, not just to repay what they had stolen, but to repair what they had destroyed. The boathouse, my boathouse, would be rebuilt at Mara's expense, using her personal assets, not the HOA's. And the HOA itself? Dissolved. Its charter revoked. Its power stripped. A receiver would oversee what little remained. The empire Mara had built from lies collapsed in a single ruling. For the first time since the orange notice appeared, I felt something like peace. But it wasn't just for me. The outcome rippled beyond my cabin, beyond the lake. Neighbors who had been fined for garden gnomes, for welcome mats, for children's toys, they were free too. The ordinance that followed, requiring audits of every HOA in the county, was a safeguard for all of us. Mara had thought she was building a kingdom. In the end, she had built her own cage. And as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, and the warrants stripped her of her illusion of control, one truth echoed louder than any fine, louder than any forged map. Bullies can build their walls, but the law will always tear them down. The war was over, or so I thought. Because even when the queen is toppled, there are always embers left behind. Embers that can ignite if left unchecked. And as I watched the federal cars pull away, Mara seated silently in the back, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Not yet. The storm had passed, at least in the eyes of the law. Mara Jansen was no longer the iron-fisted president of Lakeside Pines. She was just another convicted criminal, stripped of power, stripped of her illusion of control, and facing the weight of justice. Her treasurer had betrayed her. Her schemes were laid bare. Her HOA dissolved. On paper, the battle was over. But the aftermath of a war is never quiet. The echoes linger. For weeks, my driveway, once the stage for confrontations and threats, was a place of comings and goings. Federal agents cataloged evidence. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles, words of support, and stories of their own. Men and women who had once suffered quietly under Mara's rule found their voices again. Each one carried a variation of the same story: nonsense violations, extortionate fines, harassment designed to break them down until they either paid or left. It became clear that Mara hadn't just targeted me. She had targeted anyone who dared to live in her shadow. My case wasn't an isolated incident. It was the final straw in a long pattern of abuse. The county took note. The commissioners moved swiftly, passing a new ordinance that would ripple far beyond our lake. Every HOA in the county, from the smallest subdivision to the largest gated community, would now be subject to mandatory independent audits every 2 years. No longer could treasurers funnel money into phantom companies. No longer could presidents rule unchecked, inventing rules as they pleased. Mara's downfall had sparked change, a small revolution born from an old man's stubborn refusal to bend. But even as the legal dust settled, the personal damage lingered. My boathouse, 30 years of labor and memory, was gone. The lakefront looked naked without it, the dock jutting awkwardly into the water, ending in nothing. Each time I walked down to the shoreline, the emptiness greeted me like a wound. The judge's restitution order was clear. The boathouse would be rebuilt, paid for directly from Mara's personal assets. But money didn't ease the ache. Money couldn't replace the boards Sarah and I had painted together, the shingles we had nailed with our own hands, the laughter we shared as we argued about where to hang the windows. Still, rebuilding was necessary, not just for me, but for everyone watching. To let Mara's destruction linger would be to let her win, even from her cell. And so, one Saturday morning, a different truck pulled into my driveway. Not a flatbed with a backhoe, not a demolition crew with chainsaws, but a lumber delivery stacked high with fresh cedar planks. The smell of the wood filled the air, sharp and clean, a scent that carried with it the promise of renewal. Neighbors came too. Bill, whose voice had cracked with outrage the day my boathouse was destroyed, arrived with his tool belt slung over his shoulder. Cheryl brought coffee and sandwiches, her eyes bright with determination rather than fear. Others followed. A young father once fined for the color of his child's tricycle, an older couple who had been harassed over a garden shed. They came not just to rebuild my boathouse, but to rebuild a sense of community Mara had tried so hard to fracture. Hammers rang out, saws buzzed, boards were lifted into place. The dock that had once been a place of mourning became a place of laughter again. Children ran along the shoreline, their shouts carrying across the water, unafraid for the first time in years. It wasn't easy. The sun was hot, the work was hard, and the memories pressed heavy on my heart. But as each wall went up, as each beam was secured, I felt something shift inside me. The weight of grief began to ease, replaced by a steady resolve. Sarah and I had built the first boathouse together. Now, with the help of my neighbors and my children, we were building its successor, not as a monument to loss, but as a symbol of resilience. By Sunday evening, the frame stood tall, the roof angled to catch the sunset just as it always had. When the last nail was driven in, I climbed up onto the roof and looked out across the water. The mist rolled low, just as it had the morning this all began. For the first time in months, it looked like home again. But beneath the satisfaction of rebuilding, a truth lingered. Structures can be replaced, laws can be rewritten, communities can heal, but scars remain. The Facebook post that had smeared my name was still out there, archived for anyone to find. The photographs taken with that telephoto lens still existed on someone's hard drive. The trespassing, the threats, the intimidation, all of it left a mark. Not just on me, but on the community as a whole. We had won the battle. But battles are never without cost. In the evenings, after the hammers quieted and the neighbors went home, my children and I sat by the fireplace. They didn't speak much of the case anymore. They didn't have to. Their silence said enough. They knew, as I did, that Mara's conviction was not the end of the story. It was the closing of a chapter. And while her empire of fraud had crumbled, the embers of what she had built still smoldered. Somewhere, records remained. Somewhere, allies or sympathizers who had benefited from her rule lingered, perhaps quiet for now, but not gone. Power leaves echoes, and people who had fed on her scraps might yet try to claim them. And so, even as my new boathouse stood proudly against the lake, the thought remained. Peace had been restored, but it was fragile. The fight was over. But vigilance was not. Because if Mara had taught us anything, it was this. There will always be another who believes rules are theirs to write, laws are theirs to bend, and people are theirs to break. And when that day comes, when the next petty tyrant tries to rise, we would be ready. The lake was quiet again, the water calm. The mist hung low, just as I liked it. But in the stillness, I understood. This wasn't the end. This was the lesson. And lessons, once learned, never fade. The new boathouse stood finished, a silhouette of cedar and glass against the silver mist of the lake. It wasn't the same as the old one, nothing ever could be, but it carried something the first had not. The original had been a labor of love between my wife and me. This one was built by many hands, by neighbors bound together not by rules or dues, but by resilience. Every board nailed into place carried the weight of defiance. Every beam stood as proof that communities are stronger than tyrants. On its roof, where Sarah and I had once watched sunsets, I now stood again. But this time I wasn't alone. Below me, neighbors gathered on the dock, their laughter carrying over the water. Children ran along the shoreline, their voices bright. The air, once filled with the sound of demolition, now echoed with the harmony of rebuilding. But even in victory, scars remained. Mara's trial had ended decisively. Her conviction for conspiracy, wire fraud, and extortion was not just a punishment, it was a warning. Her treasurer, Greg, had confessed. His smug laughter turned to quiet shame in a courtroom. The restitution had been ordered, the HOA dissolved, the stolen funds traced back to her brother's sham contracting company. Every piece of her empire built on lies had been dismantled. And yet, for all the justice served, the memory of what she did lingered like a shadow across the lake. The photograph I had found in the wreckage, Sarah and I, covered in sawdust, smiling in front of the first boathouse, sat framed on my mantel. It was both a reminder of what was lost and a symbol of why I had fought. The neighbors felt it too. They carried their own scars from years of harassment. Garden gnomes deemed out of harmony. Welcome mats fined for being an inch too wide. Children's toys labeled violations. Alone, each had felt powerless. Together, they had discovered strength. And from that strength came change. The county ordinance requiring regular audits of HOAs was more than a safeguard. It was a legacy. No longer could treasurers hide slush funds behind vague line items. No longer could presidents shift property lines with forged votes. The laws had teeth now, sharpened by the fight that began with a single orange notice nailed to my boathouse door. But beyond ordinances and restitution, something greater had been built. Trust. Neighbors who had once whispered their grievances now spoke openly. They shared coffee on each other's porches. They traded stories of their children, their gardens, their lives. The community that Mara had ruled through fear was reborn, not through bylaws, but through bonds. For me, the journey left its mark. I had started as a man sipping coffee on a misty dock, blindsided by an orange notice. I had been confused, frightened, nearly broken when the boathouse came crashing down. But what Mara had underestimated was not just me, it was my family. When she thought she was targeting an old man, she was really targeting a lineage of law. My children had carried me through the fire, not with sympathy, but with action. They had turned my kitchen table into a war room, my driveway into a courtroom, my dock into the site of her downfall. They had fought not only as agents of the law, but as children defending their father. And that, more than any ordinance or restitution, was the true victory. The lake had been the stage for her arrogance. Now it was the stage for our resilience. On quiet mornings, as the mist curled over the water, I sat on the rebuilt dock with my coffee. I listened to the lap of water against the pilings, the same sound that had always been there, steady as breath. The scars remained, yes, but so did the strength. Sometimes I thought back to Mara, her voice dripping with false sweetness, her smug smile as the backhoe idled in my driveway, her fury as the sheriff handed her the cease and desist, her silence as the cuffs clicked shut. In her mind, she was untouchable, the law unto herself. In the end, she discovered the truth. You cannot forge gravity, you cannot fine away truth, and you cannot move lines drawn not just on paper, but on principle. The fight was over, but its message remained. There will always be another Mara, another petty tyrant who mistakes power for ownership, who mistakes fear for respect. But here, on this lake, she had been shown for what she was. And in her downfall, a community had been reborn. As the sun rose higher, glinting off the cedar planks of the new boathouse, I felt something I hadn't in months. Peace. Not the fragile peace of denial, but the solid peace of resolution. The cabin stood strong. The dock reached steady into the water. The boathouse, reborn, caught the morning light just as it had decades earlier. The photograph of Sarah and me hung inside, smiling as though nothing had ever been broken. And I knew, as the mist lifted and the day began, that this chapter was closed. The HOA had tried to demolish my home, my memories, my life, but in the end, they had built something they never intended, a legacy of resilience, of justice, of unity. The lake was quiet once more, and it was mine.